Clara Evans was an ordinary woman in every possible way. She lived in a small town where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever really changed. Every morning she woke up early, made herself a cup of tea, and walked to the town library where she worked. She liked her job because it was quiet, peaceful, and full of stories she could escape into. Her co-workers liked her, but no one really knew her. To them, she was just the quiet librarian who smiled politely and never caused trouble. Her clothes were simple, plain blouses and long skirts that never drew attention. She wore her hair in a neat bun, and she always carried a small notebook in her hand. No one ever saw her angry or sad or excited. She lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread filled her mornings. Every evening after the library closed, she would stop by the park, sit on the same wooden bench and feed the birds. She enjoyed silence more than conversation, and people often mistook her quietness for dullness. But inside Clara's heart lived a secret that even she had almost forgotten. Once, a long time ago, music had been her world. When she was a child, her parents had saved money to buy her a small piano. It was old and scratched, but when her fingers touched the keys, the room came alive. Her mother used to say that Clara didn't just play music, she spoke through it. But that was many years ago, and life had changed. After her parents passed away suddenly, she had to give up her dream to survive. The piano was sold, the lessons stopped, and the music in her heart grew quiet. Now as an adult, Clara avoided anything that reminded her of that dream. She told herself that life was fine as it was, calm, predictable, safe still. Sometimes when she shelved books in the library's music section, she would pause. Her eyes would drift to the covers showing great pianists on stage. Her heart would tighten for a moment, and then she'd shake her head and continue working. She believed that some dreams were only meant for childhood, and hers had already faded away on weekends. Clara sometimes went to the community center near her apartment. There, local teachers offered free art and music classes for children and adults. She often sat quietly at the back of the piano room pretending to read a book. But really, she was watching the students. Their hands stumbled on the keys, their faces full of frustration or joy. The sound of piano notes, even the wrong ones, made something inside her stir. It reminded her of a part of herself she had buried for years. Still, she never joined in. She told herself she was too old, too out of practice, too ordinary. One day, while she sat at the back of the class as usual, a new music teacher entered the room. His name was Mr. Lang, a young man full of energy and strict discipline. He believed everyone could learn music if they tried hard enough. When his eyes met Clara's, he assumed she was another shy student who had come to learn. "Come on, ma'am," he said kindly but firmly. "Don't be shy, have a seat at the piano." Clara froze, embarrassed. "Oh no," she said softly. "I'm not here to play. I'm just watching." But Mr. Lang smiled and insisted. "Everyone here learns by doing, not by watching." The other students giggled quietly, whispering among themselves. Clara's face turned red, but she didn't want to make a scene, so she slowly stood up and walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled as she sat on the small bench. It had been more than 20 years since she last touched real piano keys. Mr. Lang gave her a simple piece of music to play, something for beginners. But as her eyes scanned the notes, something inside her shifted. She knew these notes. Her fingers remembered the feeling, the rhythm, the emotion behind each line. She pressed one key, then another. The sound that came out was shaky, uneven. The student smiled politely. Thinking she was struggling, Mr. Lang sighed and said, "You need to practice. Don't worry, you'll get there." He then handed her a new sheet of music, one meant for advanced students. "Try this for next class," he said with a hint of challenge in his tone. The students looked surprised, even amused. It was a difficult classical piece that most beginners would never dare to play. Clara smiled weakly and nodded. She didn't protest or explain. She just folded the sheet carefully and put it in her bag. That evening, as she walked home, the music sheet felt heavy in her hands. She laughed softly to herself, wondering how she would ever manage to play it. But deep inside, a small spark had been lit. A memory of a stage, of applause, of her parents' proud faces. It was faint, but it was alive again. When she reached her apartment, she placed the music sheet on the table and stared at it for a long time. Something about the challenge felt different. It didn't scare her. It excited her for the first time in years. Clara Evans, the quiet librarian, felt a sense of purpose. Maybe she wasn't as ordinary as everyone thought. Maybe there was still a song left inside her waiting to be played. And as the moonlight touched her window, she whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time." Her eyes sparkled softly as she thought of the piano waiting in the community hall. For the first time in years, she went to bed smiling. The music that had once been lost was slowly finding its way back to her heart. And though no one else knew it yet, a quiet miracle had just begun. The next morning, Clara walked to work with a strange mix of calm and excitement. The town looked the same bakery smell in the air, the same faces nodding hello, yet everything felt different inside her. The paper with the piano notes tucked neatly in her handbag seemed to hum softly as if calling her name. All day at the library, her mind wandered away from the shelves and the silence. She imagined her fingers on the keys again, her heartbeat in rhythm with the music. By evening, she could no longer ignore the pull. When her shift ended, she didn't go to the park like usual. Instead, she found herself walking toward the community center. The piano classroom was empty when she arrived. Dust floated in the golden evening light. The black piano stood in the corner like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Her hands trembled as she sat down, the wooden bench creaking softly beneath her. She opened the sheet of music, a piece far too difficult for someone who hadn't played in decades. Her eyes scanned the notes, and for a moment, she felt like a lost traveler looking at a map she used to know by heart. She pressed one key and then another. The notes were shaky at first, uneven and clumsy, but soon something familiar stirred. Her fingers began to move on their own, finding patterns that her mind had long forgotten. Outside, a janitor stopped his broom. Listening to the faint sound of piano drifting through the hall, he smiled softly, unaware that he was witnessing the rebirth of something beautiful. Clara played until her fingers ached, until her shoulders hurt, but she didn't stop. Every wrong note made her laugh quietly. Every right one made her heart swell. She wasn't practicing to impress anyone. She was playing to remember who she was. When she finally left the room, her hair was messy, her cheeks were warm, and her heart was alive. That night, she went home and wrote in her notebook, "Music never really leaves you. It just waits." The next few days became a secret routine. She finished work, rushed home to eat a quick meal, then hurried to the community hall. Sometimes she played until late at night, losing track of time completely. Her neighbors, hearing the faint music through the windows, started wondering who the mysterious pianist was. Some thought it was a recording. Others believed it was a visiting teacher. No one suspected it was quiet Clara from the library. At first, she struggled to reach the difficult parts of the piece Mr. Lang had given her. Her fingers would slip and she'd frown, then laugh and start again, but every night, she got better, smoother, more confident. Each chord unlocked a forgotten memory, her mother clapping proudly, her father humming along. The room filled with their ghosts, not sad or haunting, but loving. It was as if her parents' spirits were sitting beside her, smiling as she played, and with every note she felt them closer. One evening as she played, the door creaked open. Mr. Lang stood there silently holding his coat. He had forgotten his papers in the classroom and had returned to fetch them. When he heard the music, he froze. The sound was not from a student struggling through scales. It was deep, emotional, alive. He peeked in and saw Clara, the quiet woman he had assumed couldn't tell a G-sharp from a C major, playing like a professional. Her eyes were closed, her body moved with the rhythm. The air around her seemed to shimmer with something magical. Mr. Lang didn't interrupt. He stood by the door, mesmerized, listening to the rise and fall of the melody. When the last note faded into silence, Clara sighed softly, not realizing she had an audience. Mr. Lang clapped his hands gently. Clara jumped, her eyes wide in shock. "Oh, I didn't know anyone was here," she said, her cheeks turning pink. Mr. Lang smiled, half in amazement, half in guilt. "Miss Evans," he said quietly. "That was incredible." She looked down, twisting her fingers nervously. "I was just practicing," she murmured. "Practicing?" he repeated with a small laugh. "You play like someone who's lived with music her whole life." Clara hesitated, unsure whether to tell him the truth. For years she had hidden that part of her life, afraid it would sound like a dream that didn't belong to her anymore. But something in Mr. Lang's voice made her open up. "I used to play," she said softly, "a long time ago, before life got in the way." Mr. Lang nodded slowly, his eyes full of respect. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said. "Music like that shouldn't be silent." His words touched her more deeply than she expected. She smiled faintly and replied, "Maybe it was just waiting for the right time." From that day on, things changed. Mr. Lang treated her differently, not as a beginner, but as an artist rediscovering her voice. He asked her to perform the difficult piece at the next student recital. Clara was terrified at the idea. It had been years since she'd played in front of anyone, but a quiet voice inside her whispered, "You can do this." So she agreed. The news spread quickly among the students. They were curious and skeptical, whispering that the librarian was going to embarrass herself. But Clara didn't care. She practiced harder than ever. Every night, every spare moment, her fingers became strong again, her rhythm flawless, her confidence returning with each passing day. The music that once belonged to her childhood now belonged to her again. The night before the recital, Clara sat by her window, the moonlight glowing on her sheet music. Her hands rested on her lap, calm but ready. She whispered softly, "Tomorrow, I'll play for them and for you, Mama, Papa." Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant chimes, and inside, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years, joy mixed with peace. The stage was waiting, and so was her destiny that night. After her final practice, Clara walked home slowly through the quiet streets. The autumn air was cool and crisp, the leaves swirling around her feet like tiny dancers. She could still hear the echo of the piano in her mind, those soft, aching notes that had become her nightly companions. But tonight something felt different, deeper, almost haunting. When she reached her apartment, she didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she walked straight to the old wooden trunk sitting in the corner of her room. It had been there for years, gathering dust. Inside it lay the pieces of a life she had locked away. Clara knelt down and ran her fingers over the lid. Her heart pounded as if warning her that what she was about to open would change everything. With a small creak, she lifted it, and the smell of old paper and cedar filled the air. Inside were yellowed music sheets, worn photographs, and a small silver locket. She pulled out one of the sheets, the edges torn, the ink fadings, and her breath caught. It was Nocturne in E-flat major by Chopin, the same piece she had performed when she was only 12. Her mind drifted back to that day. She was a little girl again, sitting at a grand piano under the soft glow of stage lights. The audience waited in silence, and her mother stood backstage, hands clasped in nervous pride. When Clara began to play, the world disappeared. She didn't see faces or lights, only heard the melody flowing through her like a heartbeat. When the last note faded, there was a pause, a breath, and then thunderous applause. Her mother's tears sparkled in the crowd. That was the happiest day of her life. But then came the darker memories, the letter, the accident, the long nights of silence after her parents' deaths, the way she sold her piano to pay rent, the day she told her teacher she couldn't continue lessons. He had placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "The world will miss your music, Clara." She remembered walking home that evening with empty hands and a heavy heart. The music had stopped. And with it, part of her had too now. Sitting in the glow of a single lamp, Clara looked at the same sheet music through tears. So many years had passed, but the notes still spoke to her. She placed the paper on her table, smoothing the wrinkles as though it were something fragile and precious. Then she reached deeper into the trunk and found an old cassette tape, labeled in her father's handwriting, "Clara's First Concert." She smiled faintly and searched her drawer for the dusty tape recorder she hadn't used in decades. When she pressed play, the sound of faint applause filled the room, followed by her own young voice whispering nervously, "Ready, Mama?" Then came the piano, her piano, bright, full of emotion, alive. The sound filled the tiny apartment like sunlight, and for the first time in years, Clara let herself cry. She listened all night, sometimes laughing at her mistakes, sometimes closing her eyes to feel the warmth of that lost time. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would not hide her gift anymore. The recital at the community hall wasn't just a small event now. For Clara, it had become a promise to her parents, to her younger self. She whispered into the morning light, "I'll play again, properly this time." That day at the library, she could barely focus when people asked if she was all right. She smiled and said she was fine, but inside her thoughts were racing. After work, she stopped by a small antique store on her way home. In the window stood an old upright piano with delicate carvings on its legs. She stepped inside and asked the shop owner about it. "It's been sitting there for years," the man said. "No one seems to want it." Clara ran her fingers over the keys. They were slightly out of tune, but the sound was pure. She smiled softly. "I want it," she said. The man looked surprised. "You play?" She nodded. "Not yet, but I will again." That evening, the piano was delivered to her apartment. The neighbors peeked through their doors, curious about the sudden commotion. When the movers left, Clara stood alone before it. Her reflection shimmered on its polished surface. She sat down, pressing one key, then another. The sound filled the room. Rich and honest, for a moment she just sat there, feeling the vibrations under her fingertips. Then slowly, she began to play the Chopin piece from her childhood. At first, her fingers stumbled. Her timing faltered, but the longer she played, the more the music remembered her. It was like reuniting with an old friend who still remembered every secret, every laugh, every tear. As the days passed, her small apartment became a haven of music again. The neighbors began leaving their windows open just to listen. Children stopped on the street below to hear the mysterious pianist who played at dusk. And Clara, once quiet, invisible Clara, began to glow again. She played with heart, with history, with gratitude. Every note she played was a letter to her parents, a conversation with her past. She began to realize that music wasn't just something she did. It was who she was. One night, as she practiced, she noticed a figure standing outside her window. It was Mr. Lang, holding a folder of music sheets, his face filled with admiration. He had followed the sound and discovered where it came from. When she opened the door, he smiled. "I thought I recognized that touch," he said softly. Clara laughed shyly. "You caught me." "I didn't catch you," he replied. "I just found what the world almost lost that night." They sat together, surrounded by stacks of music. He listened as she played, sometimes joining in on a second piano part. For the first time in decades, Clara didn't feel alone when she played. It was as if life had come full circle, the silence of her past melting into a new beginning, and deep inside her she knew this was only the start. The recital would soon come, but Clara Evans, the quiet librarian, had already found her music again, and this time she wasn't going to let it go. Every night after work, Clara returned home with the same quiet determination. But now, instead of books and solitude, her world revolved around a piano. Her small apartment, once filled only with silence and the ticking of an old clock, now pulsed with melody. The moment she turned the key in her door, she felt her heartbeat sync with the rhythm waiting inside. Her new piano stood by the window, its surface shining softly in the evening light. It had become her companion, her secret, her rebirth. She would place her handbag on the chair, roll up her sleeves, and sit down before it. Sometimes she closed her eyes before touching the keys, whispering a quiet promise. "Let's see what we remember tonight." The first note would always tremble slightly, but soon her hands moved with purpose. The music flowed through the air like the scent of old memories, gentle, warm, and full of longing. Every piece she played took her somewhere else, somewhere she had been before but forgotten. At first her fingers were stiff, clumsy. Her mind had to fight the years of stillness. But day after day her hands grew lighter, her rhythm steadier, and slowly, the gap between who she was and who she used to be began to close. Sometimes she played until her arms ached, sometimes until dawn, and even when her fingers hurt, she smiled because pain meant progress. The kind of pain that whispered, "You're alive again," one evening. As the rain poured outside, she played with the window open. The drops tapped softly on the glass, creating a natural rhythm to accompany her. She began playing Moonlight Sonata, a piece that had always haunted her. The melody blended with the rain, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Her neighbor from below, an elderly man named Mr. Patel, came upstairs and knocked softly. When she opened the door, he smiled, holding a small candle in his hand. "Your music," he said in a trembling voice. "It reminds me of my wife." Clara's heart swelled, and she invited him in. He sat quietly, listening as she played, tears glistening in his eyes. When she finished, he whispered, "Don't ever stop," and left. Leaving the candle behind, from that night on, Clara realized something powerful. Her music wasn't just healing her. It was touching others too. She began leaving her windows open wider. Soon people would pause on the street below, looking up as the sound floated into the night. Children pointed, calling her the lady who plays in the sky. She would smile shyly when she heard them. But deep inside, she felt something blooming, pride mixed with peace. Every day after that, she practiced even harder. Mr. Lang visited her often, bringing new sheets of music and gentle encouragement. Sometimes he would sit beside her, playing duets, their fingers moved in harmony, their laughter filling the small room. "Do you realize," he once said, "that you play differently from anyone else I've taught?" Clara looked at him curiously. "Differently?" "Yes," he smiled. "Most people play to be heard, but you play to feel." That compliment stayed with her, echoing in her heart long after he left one night. As she practiced a particularly difficult piece, Liszt's Liebestraum, her frustration grew. Her hands slipped, her timing faltered, and she let out an exhausted sigh. Her reflection in the piano's polished surface looked tired but defiant. Then, as if her mother's voice whispered from the past, she remembered something. When music stops flowing, stop fighting it, just listen. Clara closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the silence fill the room. Then gently she began again, slower this time, letting the notes carry her rather than control her. It was no longer about perfection, but about truth. The sound that emerged was softer, richer, filled with emotion that no practice could teach. When she finally stopped, her eyes were wet. She realized that what she played tonight wasn't just music. It was a conversation with her soul. Weeks passed like this: work, home, practice, music, repeat. The recital was only a month away, and Clara could feel the anticipation building around her. People at the community center whispered about the quiet librarian who had transformed overnight. Some doubted her, others admired her courage. But Clara didn't care what they said. She wasn't doing it for fame or praise. She was doing it for the little girl who once dreamed and never got to finish her song. One late evening, when the city was asleep, Clara played her final note for the night and looked out the window. The moon was bright, casting silver light across her piano. The world was silent except for the faint hum of her heart still beating in rhythm with the keys. She smiled softly and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." In that moment, she felt the presence of her parents, not as ghosts, but as warmth in the air. They were listening, and she knew it. That night she placed the candle Mr. Patel had given her on the piano. Its small flame flickered gently beside her sheet music. It became her ritual. One candle for every night of practice, and soon her windowsill filled with tiny wax stubs, a quiet record of her journey. By the time the recital approached, Clara's playing had become effortless. Her music was alive, breathing with emotion and soul. She didn't just play, she told stories through her notes. Stories of loss and rediscovery, silence and sound, fear and courage. When she played, the piano seemed to understand her perfectly, and though no one else could see it, Clara knew. Each night she practiced. She wasn't just preparing for a concert, she was preparing to reclaim her life, and so, when the final night before the recital arrived, she didn't feel nervous. She sat before the piano, touched its keys softly, and whispered, "We're ready." Her hands began to move, and the music that filled the air that night was different. It was pure, honest, and filled with every emotion she had ever buried. Outside, the wind carried the melody through the town, and anyone awake at that hour paused to listen. None of them knew her story, but every one of them felt it. Because when Clara Evans played, she wasn't just playing the piano, she was teaching the world how to feel again. The night of the recital arrived like a dream. Clara wasn't sure she was ready to wake from. The air was crisp, the streets glimmered faintly with evening lights, and the small community hall buzzed with quiet excitement. Inside, rows of wooden chairs lined up neatly under the soft yellow glow of chandeliers. Students tuned their instruments, whispered nervously, and flipped through crumpled sheets of music. Parents sat proudly in the audience, whispering about their children's performances. And in the far corner, Claire Evans sat alone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She wore a simple navy blue dress, nothing fancy, just something clean and modest. Her hair was tied back, her eyes calm but deep, holding the reflection of 1,000 emotions. To the others, she looked like a shy beginner, maybe someone's aunt who had decided to take up piano late in life. They didn't know that beneath her calm expression lived a storm of memory, talent and emotion that had waited decades to be released. Mr. Lang moved through the room, encouraging each student with a pat on the shoulder or a quiet smile. When he saw Clara sitting silently, he stopped beside her and whispered, "You'll be wonderful, Miss Evans." She smiled softly but didn't speak. Her throat was too tight with feeling. As the lights dimmed slightly and the first performer began to play, Clara closed her eyes. The soft notes of a child's piano piece floated through the air, cheerful but uncertain, one after another. Students performed, some nervous, some proud, some just happy it was over. Then finally her name was called. Next, we have Miss Clara Evans performing Liebestraum by Franz Liszt, the announcer said. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Some people leaned forward. Curious, isn't she the librarian? Someone whispered, "Oh, this will be interesting." Clara rose from her seat slowly, her heart thudding like a drum as she walked to the piano. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but she didn't let herself look at anyone. Her gaze stayed fixed on the black grand piano waiting at the center of the stage. The bench creaked softly as she sat, and for a moment she didn't move. The silence was heavy, tense. Even Mr. Lang held his breath, unsure if she would play. Then Clara placed her trembling hands on the keys and whispered under her breath, "For you, Mama, Papa." The first note rang out like a drop of water falling into still air. Then another, then another. The melody began softly and hesitant, fragile. But then it grew, blooming like light through a window. Within seconds, the hall was filled with sound so rich, so alive that the audience forgot to breathe. Her fingers danced across the keys, not with force but with grace. It was as if the piano wasn't being played. It was speaking. Every note carried emotion, sorrow, love, longing, hope. She poured her entire soul into the song. It wasn't just a performance. It was a confession. Years of silence and pain transformed into beauty. As she played, memories flashed before her eyes. Her father watching proudly at her first recital. Her mother whispering encouragement backstage. The day she sold her piano, the first time she touched one again. The candlelight, the rain, Mr. Patel's tearful smile. All of it lived in the music, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if they didn't understand why. When the piece reached its crescendo, Clara's entire body seemed to glow with energy. Her hands moved faster, her eyes closed, tears streaming down her cheeks as the final notes cascaded through the hall. Then came the silence. That pure, holy silence that follows something extraordinary. For a heartbeat, no one moved, and then the applause came, not polite clapping, but thunderous, emotional applause that filled the entire room. People stood, clapping and cheering, some even crying. Mr. Lang had tears in his eyes as he whispered, "I knew it." Clara stood, breathless, her hands trembling as she bowed. For a moment, she couldn't believe what had just happened. The sound of the applause wrapped around her like sunlight. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the quiet librarian who watched others chase their dreams. She had become the dream itself. After the performance, people surrounded her. Students asked how long she'd been playing. Parents shook her hand, and one woman said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Clara smiled shyly, saying thank you, though her mind was still lost in the echo of her own music. When she finally stepped outside for air, the night was cool and peaceful. The stars glittered above her, and the sound of applause still lingered in her ears. Mr. Lang joined her on the steps, hands in his pockets, smiling warmly. "You proved them all wrong," he said quietly. Clara chuckled. "I wasn't trying to." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it special." They stood there for a while, looking up at the stars. Saying nothing more, Clara breathed deeply. Feeling lighter than she had in years, something had shifted inside her. Something powerful and permanent. The little girl who once cried over lost dreams had finally grown up and reclaimed them. When she returned home that night, she placed the program from the recital on her piano. Next to it, she lit a candle, the same candle Mr. Patel had given her. Its soft flame flickered gently beside her music sheets. She sat down and touched the piano keys once more, letting her fingers drift into a quiet melody. This time it wasn't for practice or for an audience. It was for her, for peace, for gratitude, for everything she had lost and found again. Outside, the town slept peacefully, but through one open window a soft tune floated into the night. Anyone who heard it might have thought it was just a song, but for Clara Evans it was something far more profound. It was freedom, the sound of a woman who had once been forgotten, now remembered again, not by the world but by herself. And as the last note faded into the dark, she smiled softly and whispered, "Now the music will never stop again." The next morning, sunlight streamed through Clara's window, golden and warm, gliding over the piano keys like a silent blessing. Her hands rested on her lap as she sat quietly before the instrument, still in her nightgown, her hair unbrushed, her eyes distant. The echoes of last night's applause still rang in her ears, not loud or boastful, but gentle like waves against a quiet shore. She could hardly believe it had happened for years. She had lived like a ghost among people, unnoticed and ordinary. But now something inside her had awakened, something she thought had died long ago. The phone rang suddenly, startling her. She picked it up, her voice small. "Hello? Miss Evans?" came Mr. Lang's cheerful tone. "You made the front page of the local arts column." Clara froze. "Front page?" "Yes," he laughed. "They called you the hidden maestro. Someone recorded your performance last night and shared it online. It's everywhere." Clara's heart skipped, her face flushing with disbelief. I didn't even know anyone was filming," she said. "Well," Mr. Lang replied warmly, "the world knows now, and it's about time." After hanging up, Clara sat for a long time in silence, staring at her piano. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Her small, private rediscovery of music had suddenly become something bigger, something that belonged to others too. By afternoon, the doorbell rang, and when she opened it, a group of her neighbors stood outside, smiling. "Miss Evans," said Mrs. Patel, the florist from down the street, holding a bouquet of lilies. "We saw your video. It was beautiful." The others nodded eagerly, offering small gifts, cookies, flowers, even handwritten notes. Clara felt overwhelmed, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never been the center of attention, and now all this kindness made her eyes misty. That evening, she sat by the piano again. But this time, the keys looked different. Not just instruments of sound, but doors, each one a key to something she had once locked away. Her strength, her courage, her soul. She played quietly, improvising new melodies that carried no name. No composer, only feeling. As the music filled the room, she realized she wasn't just revisiting her past anymore. She was creating a new one. Note by note, moment by moment, days turned into weeks, and life around Clara changed. People began to recognize her at the library. Strangers came to borrow music books just to meet her. Children shyly asked, "Miss Evans, will you teach us to play like you?" At first she laughed it off, unsure she could be anyone's teacher, but Mr. Lang encouraged her. "Music isn't just about skill," he said. "It's about heart. And you have more of that than anyone I've ever met." So she began teaching, not in a grand studio, but right in her apartment. A small group of students came each week. Some were children, others adults who had given up long ago. She taught them gently, patiently, always reminding them that music wasn't about being perfect. "It's about saying what your heart can't with words," she would tell them. And her students listened because when she said it, they believed it. Sometimes she played for them, showing them how emotion could shape sound. And every time she did, they watched her with wide eyes, as if witnessing magic. One afternoon, as she was finishing a lesson, Mr. Lang stopped by. He carried a letter with an elegant gold seal. "What's this?" Clara asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. He smiled. "An invitation from the City Symphony Committee." Clara blinked. "For what?" "They want you to perform at their upcoming charity gala," he said proudly. "They loved your story, Clara. They want to feature you as their guest pianist." Her mouth fell open. Gala?" He nodded. "You deserve it." That night, Clara sat awake, the letter open on her lap for so long. She had played in silence, hidden from the world. Now, the same world was asking her to step into its light. It scared her, but it thrilled her too. She thought of her parents, how proud they would have been, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She whispered softly, "I'll do it." Preparation for the gala began immediately. Mr. Lang helped her select the right piece, a blend of grace and emotion, something uniquely her. She chose Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece she used to dream of performing as a teenager. Every evening she practiced with renewed energy. Her fingers moved faster, her tone stronger, but her heart softer. Because this time, she wasn't chasing perfection, she was sharing truth. As she played, memories mixed with melodies. Her mother's laughter, her father's claps, the candlelight nights, the rain, the children in the street below. It all became part of her sound, a symphony of everything she had lived through. And sometimes when she finished playing, she would sit quietly, hands on her lap, eyes wet, whispering, "Thank you." Finally, the day of the gala arrived. The grand hall shimmered with chandeliers and velvet curtains. The audience was full of elegant faces, famous musicians, and critics. Clara stood backstage, dressed in a soft ivory gown. Her heart pounding, she took a deep breath, remembering Mr. Lang's words, "Play like you're speaking to the ones who can't answer. That's when music becomes eternal." When she stepped onto the stage, the audience applauded politely, unaware of the story behind the gentle woman before them. Then she sat at the grand piano, the spotlight catching the silver in her hair. Her fingers touched the keys, and the world disappeared. The first notes drifted into the air like light breaking through clouds. Every sound shimmered with emotion. People leaned forward, entranced, and by the time she reached the final passage, the entire hall had fallen into a spell of silence. When she finished, there was no immediate applause, only stillness. Then one by one, people rose to their feet. A standing ovation, thunderous and unending. Mr. Lang wiped a tear from his eye, whispering, "She did it," backstage. When it was all over, Clara smiled quietly to herself. She had come from a small town, a silent apartment, a forgotten dream. But now her music had found its way back into the world, not as fame or glory, but as a living, breathing piece of her soul, and in that moment, she understood something profound. She hadn't been rediscovered by the world. She had rediscovered herself, and that was the most beautiful music of all. The weeks following the gala felt like living in a dream Clara never wanted to end. The newspaper still rested on her piano. The headline read, "The hidden maestro stuns the city symphony." But even after all the praise, the applause, and the sudden fame, Clara remained the same. She still woke up early to brew her morning tea, still took quiet walks by the park, still smiled at the children who waved from across the street. Only now, people recognized her. Strangers stopped her to say how her performance had touched them. Some told her they'd cried listening to her play. Others said she'd inspired them to chase forgotten dreams. Every word filled her heart with warmth, but also a quiet humility. For Clara Evans had never wanted to be famous. She only wanted to feel alive again, and now she was. Yet something inside her had changed. A new spark had taken root. She began to dream again, not of stages or audiences, but of teaching. She wanted to share what she had learned, that music wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real. And so she began offering small piano lessons in her apartment every weekend. The word spread quickly. Soon her tiny living room was filled with students of all ages, children, teenagers, even an elderly woman who'd always regretted quitting music. Clara rearranged her furniture, set out chairs, and placed a small basket of sweets near the door. It was cozy, warm, and full of laughter. Each lesson began the same way, Clara would say. "Don't worry about playing the right note. Worry about playing the true one," the children would giggle, not fully understanding, but by the end of each class they did. When they played a simple melody and smiled because it felt right, not because it sounded perfect, Clara knew she was doing something right. Mr. Lang often dropped by to help, bringing more instruments and music sheets. Sometimes he'd sit by the window, sipping tea while listening to the sound of young fingers discovering rhythm. "You've built something beautiful here," he told her one afternoon. Clara smiled, brushing dust off the piano lid. "I just built what I needed all those years ago. A place where music feels like home." The students adored her. They called her Miss Clara, and often stayed after class talking about life, dreams, and fears. One little girl named Sophie once asked, "Miss Clara, were you ever scared to play in front of people?" Clara smiled softly. "Every time, dear. Even now. Especially now," Clara said with a wink. "But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's playing anyway." That became the motto pinned on her wall, handwritten in neat cursive. As months passed, her lessons became more popular. Parents from nearby towns brought their children, and local radio even invited her for an interview. When the host asked her what kept her going, she simply said, "Music saved me when nothing else could. If it can save someone else, even for a moment, that's enough for me." Despite her new recognition, Clara never forgot her roots. She still played alone each night, sometimes until dawn. Her music had grown deeper, not louder, not faster, but wiser. Every note carried the weight of everything she'd lived. The sorrow, the silence, the rediscovery. Sometimes she'd pause mid-song and smile. Remembering her parents, she imagined them sitting on the couch. Proud and peaceful listening, she would whisper softly, "We did it," and continue playing. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. After her final class of the day, a young man approached her, shy, tall, carrying a violin case. "Miss Evans?" he said nervously. I'm from the conservatory downtown. My name's Daniel." She nodded kindly. "Hello, Daniel." He smiled awkwardly. "I watched your performance online, and it changed me." Clara tilted her head. Intrigued, he continued, "I was ready to quit music. I'd been failing auditions, losing confidence, but after hearing you play, I realized something. Music doesn't have to impress. It has to connect." Clara's eyes softened. "You understood perfectly." He hesitated, then said, "Our conservatory is organizing a mentorship program for young musicians. Would you consider being part of it?" For a moment, Clara was speechless. Her heart pounded. The thought of mentoring at a conservatory, something she'd once only dreamed of as a young pianist, now seemed within reach. She smiled warmly. "I'd be honored." That night she sat by her piano, the city lights glowing softly outside, and whispered, "So the journey continues." Teaching at the conservatory opened a new world for Clara. She walked into classrooms filled with talented, restless students. They respected her not for her fame, but for her humility, her patience, and her deep understanding of emotion. One day during a master class, a student asked her, "What's the secret to becoming a great musician?" Clara paused, then said, "To stop trying to be great and start trying to be honest." The class fell silent, and they knew she meant it. Weeks later, the conservatory held a joint concert. Clara's students and her community learners performed together. The stage was filled with nervous smiles and shining eyes. When the lights dimmed, Clara stood beside them, her hands steady and proud as the music began. She didn't play this time. She listened, and for the first time, she realized the most beautiful sound in the world wasn't her own performance. It was the sound of others discovering theirs. The audience erupted in applause, but Clara didn't bow this time. She simply looked at her students, beaming with quiet pride. They had learned not just to play, but to feel, and that was her greatest masterpiece. That night, after everyone left, she sat alone in the empty hall. The lights dimmed. The piano gleamed under the last bit of glow. She placed her hand on the keys, not to play, but to thank them. In the silence, she whispered, "You've given me everything, and I've given you back to the world." Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of laughter and music. Clara closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. Her journey had started in loneliness, born from loss and forgotten dreams, but now she had created something lasting, a legacy of sound and soul. And as she finally rose from the bench, she smiled, knowing one truth with all her heart: her music would continue, not through her hands, but through every heart she had touched. The night of the grand concert arrived like a whisper carried by destiny. The city lights shimmered across the river, reflecting on the concert hall's glass walls like golden stars trapped on earth. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Hundreds of people filled the seats, their murmurs rising like waves of anticipation. Reporters gathered near the entrance, cameras ready, their voices buzzing about the hidden maestro's return. For Clara Evans, it felt unreal. Just a year ago, she had been the quiet librarian who fed pigeons after work, and now her name was printed on glossy posters that read, "Clara Evans, the woman who found music again." Backstage, she stood in front of a mirror, hands trembling slightly. She wore a simple cream-colored gown that flowed like soft light when she moved. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back elegantly. She looked older, yes, but radiant. Not the kind of beauty that comes from youth, but from peace, from purpose, from truth. The kind of glow that only comes from someone who has walked through pain and found grace on the other side. As she waited for her cue, she could hear the orchestra warming up. The strings hummed softly, the flutes tested their breath. The timpani rumbled faintly, and through all of it, her heart beat in rhythm, not with fear, but with life. Mr. Lang approached from behind, smiling proudly. "You ready to make the world hold its breath again?"
he asked gently. Clara smiled. "I'm not here to make them hold their breath," she said.
"I'm here to help them remember how to feel." He chuckled softly. "You always were different." When her name was announced, the audience erupted in applause. Clara stepped into the light, her heels clicking softly against the wooden stage. The grand piano stood at the center, shining under the spotlight like an old friend. She walked toward it slowly, reverently. Each step felt like a chapter closing. And another beginning. When she sat down, the entire hall fell silent. No whispers, no movement, just the quiet hum of expectation. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. For a moment, she didn't play. She simply listened to the silence, to the heartbeat of the room, to her own breathing. And then softly she began. The melody rose like dawn, delicate, graceful, full of longing. Her fingers floated across the keys with effortless precision. But it wasn't her skill that moved people, it was her truth. Every note carried her story, the years of silence, the rediscovery, the laughter of her students, the memory of her parents. It was all there, woven into the sound like threads of gold in a tapestry of sound. In the front row, a little girl held her mother's hand and whispered. She looked so happy, and she was, for the first time. Clara wasn't performing for approval. She was playing for joy, for gratitude, for love. Her music filled the hall, wrapping around every listener like a warm embrace. People closed their eyes, some even wept quietly. Because her music didn't just reach their ears, it reached their hearts. As she played the final movement, the orchestra joined in. The violins soared, the cellos wept, the flutes shimmered like wind through autumn leaves. Clara's piano danced between them, guiding, blending, leading. And as the music built to its peak, she felt a strange calm wash over her. She could almost feel her parents there, her father's proud gaze, her mother's gentle smile, and then, with one final breathtaking chord, she let the music fade into silence. The hall remained still for a long, sacred moment, then, slowly, the applause began, soft at first, then thunderous, unstoppable. People stood, clapping, cheering, shouting her name. Tears filled Clara's eyes as she rose and bowed deeply. In that moment, she wasn't the hidden maestro anymore. She was simply Clara Evans, the girl who never gave up on her music. Even when the world forgot her, after the concert, the organizers invited her to speak. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice trembling slightly but warm. "Thank you," she began softly, "for listening, not just to me, but to what the music wanted to say." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces glowing under the stage lights. "For many years I thought my music was lost forever," she continued. "I thought age, time, and silence had taken it from me. But what I've learned is that music never leaves us. It waits, patiently for us to come back to it." Her voice grew steadier. "And sometimes, we have to lose everything before we can truly hear it again." The audience was silent. Hanging on every word, she smiled softly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "So if any of you have a dream you've buried, don't let it die, because the heart doesn't forget what it was made for." The hall erupted once more into applause, louder and longer than before. Afterward, as the night grew late, Clara slipped outside into the cool evening air. The city was quiet, the streets empty, the moon hanging low and bright. She stood under its glow, her hands still tingling from the music. A light breeze carried the faint sound of laughter from the concert hall behind her. She smiled and whispered into the night, "We did it, Mama. We did it, Papa." When she returned home, the apartment was dark except for the soft flicker of candlelight on the piano, the same candle she had lit on the night she found her music again. She walked to it slowly, tracing the piano's smooth edge with her fingertips. Then she sat down. No audience, no cameras, no stage, just her and the keys. She began to play something gentle, something new, a melody no one had ever heard before. It was soft and sweet, like a goodbye whispered between souls who understand each other perfectly. Outside her window, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall. They landed silently on the street below, each one unique, delicate, fleeting, like a note in her final song. And as Clara played, the candle's flame danced beside her. It swayed with the rhythm of her music, until the last note faded into the quiet room, and she smiled, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The piano fell silent again, but this time it wasn't an ending, it was peace. Because the world had finally heard her song, and through that song, Clara Evans, the once ordinary woman, would live forever